I am Anita Krug, Dean of Chicago-Kent College of Law, and I am thrilled to see all of you here today for the latest installment of our Centennial Lecture series. And I'm also thrilled to welcome our speaker this year, Dean Angela Onwuachi-Willig, who is a renowned legal scholar and of course, Dean of Boston University School of Law, whose lecture is entitled The Trauma of Justice. We are so honored to have her join us here today. And there is really so much I could say about Dean Onwuachi-Willig, but I will leave the pleasure of introducing her to my colleague, Professor Kim Bailey. I will, however, express my view that Dean Onwuachi-Willig's research has been essential to ongoing and very, very necessary conversations around building a more equitable and just society. And while Dean Onwuachi-Willig is the most recent in a list of distinguished academics in our Centennial series, in my mind, she is one of the most important because her topic goes to the root of what we all are here for, our common mission in signing on to the legal enterprise. And that mission is furthering justice, including doing all that we can to correct injustices where they are most pervasive and where they are most challenging. And so again, it is just wonderful to have Dean Onwuachi-Willig with us. But without saying any more, now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Bailey, who again will introduce Dean Onwuachi-Willig. And it is apt that she will do the introduction as she and Dean Onwuachi-Willig have some things in common. First, both of them graduated from the University of Michigan Law School. And second, Professor Bailey's research likewise focuses on injustice, namely social, political, and economic equalities that continue to be reflected in our criminal law. So welcome again, everyone, and I'll go ahead and turn things over to Professor Bailey.
Thank you, Dean Krug. It is now my extreme pleasure to introduce our guest today. A graduate of Grinnell College, where she earned her BA, University of Michigan Law School, where she earned her JD, and Yale University, where she earned her PhD, Angela Onwuachi-Willig is Dean and Ryan Ross Gallo and Ernest J. Gallo Professor of Law at Boston University School of Law. Previously, she served as Chancellor's Professor of Law at UC Berkeley, the Charles and Marion Kirch Professor of Law at the University of Iowa, and Acting Assistant Professor of Law at UC Davis. She is author of According to Our Hearts, Rhinelander versus Rhinelander, and the Law of the Multiracial Family, and numerous articles, appearing in leading law journals in the Yale Law Journal and California Law Review. She is a former Iowa Supreme Court finalist, a recipient of Law and Society Association's John Hope Franklin Award, and the double ALS Minority Sections Clyde Ferguson and Derek Bell Awards. One of the recipients of the inaugural double ALS Impact Award, plus an elected member of the American Law Institute. The title for today's lecture is The Trauma of Injustice. Dean Onwuachi-Willig, we are so thrilled to have you with us here today. Welcome to Chicago-Kent.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dean Krug. Thank you very much, Professor Bailey, for the kind introduction. I also want to extend my sincere thanks both to Dean Krug and to Professor Shapiro for the invitation to give the Centennial Lecture. It's an incredible honor to give this lecture, and I'm grateful for the honor. I also want to thank Assistant Dean Marsha Ross Jackson for her excellent work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and for her partnership on these really important issues. And of course, I want to thank my dear friend, Professor Kim Bailey, for moderating the discussion following this lecture. And then finally, before I get to the audience, I want to thank Tasha Kincaid for all of her efforts in making this lecture come to life. And of course, I want to thank you for attending this talk. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to share my work with you. So my lecture today extends out of my book project that examines the impact of police and quasi-police killings of unarmed African Americans, or in particular, the impact of acquittals and repeated non-indictments that have frequently followed these killings on African Americans as a group. That book project, which is tentatively titled From Lynching as Status Quo to the New Status Quo, considers how police and quasi-police killings of unarmed or otherwise non-threatening Blacks, think Philando Castile, and more importantly, the legal outcomes in those cases can deepen our understanding about what sociologists have defined as cultural trauma. So according to Professor Jeffrey Alexander of Yale University, cultural trauma occurs when members of a collective feel that they've been subjected to, I guess the next slide, I'm sorry, my post. They've subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. So important things to remember about cultural traumas is they forever change a group. They are socially mediated processes, meaning what matters, of course, is that the narrative that emerges outside of the event, not the event itself, but how the event is understood by communities is really the essential part. And another part that was said in the initial theory about it is that they arise out of the unexpected or shocks to the routine that communities have come to take for granted. So I first came to this work on cultural trauma unintentionally and even unknowingly. Prior to engaging in my current work, I really wrote scholarship in the area of family law, anti-discrimination law, really focusing on employment discrimination or affirmative action. And so even though I, as a citizen, was certainly interested in the police and quasi-police killings that African Americans of a group have largely perceived as unjust, I had not been moved to write about these killings and their legal outcomes. And then on February 26, 2012, George Zimmerman, a then 28-year-old man of white American and Peruvian descent, who served as the neighborhood watch captain for his gated community in Sanford, Florida, shot and killed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, an African American boy who was a guest of a resident in the gated community that George Zimmerman lived in, and who was walking home from a local convenience store after a candy and soda run. An unarmed Trayvon Martin had nothing on his person but his cell phone, an Arizona watermelon soda, a bag of Skittles, approximately $40 in cash, a cigarette lighter, and some headphones. And I wish I could say that in 2012, that wasn't a unique year with respect to the killing of an unarmed African American boy like Trayvon Martin, followed by an acquittal of his killer, but it was not. In fact, long before 2012, J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant, two white men in Mississippi, escaped judicial punishment for their brutal beating and murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till, a son of Chicago, in 1955. In fact, since the founding of this country, violent killings of unarmed African Americans, including lynchings, have occurred over and over again, frequently without any punishment for their killers. And nevertheless, it was Trayvon Martin's slaying in 2012 that drew my personal attention like no other. And I cannot explain exactly why 2012, as opposed to any other year, compelled me to begin to think about writing about these killings, but I suspect that it had something to do with the fact that my oldest son turned 14 in 2012. After all, 14 was the age of Emmett Till when J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant lynched him during the summer of 1955. That fact, coupled with my viewing pictures of a young Trayvon Martin in his football uniform, left me to some extent traumatized in the psychological, meaning individual, as opposed to sociological, meaning group sense. Seeing Trayvon Martin's childhood photographs day in and day out forced me to look at my own son, who is as non-threatening as can be, and consider how others may view him as threatening for no reason other than the color of his skin, his gender, and his age. To these people, it wouldn't matter how smart he is, or how tender he is with his brother, or how much he likes to listen to Korean pop music. All that would matter to these people was that he was brown, matched by a height that signals that he is no longer just a kid. And it was not lost on me that this risk was even more prevalent for the children of African Americans, and that the risk in this particular case, in the Trayvon Martin case, like me, those in the middle and upper middle class, those Blacks who were most likely to find themselves integrating neighborhoods where white residents may question their place and belonging, or view them or their children if strangers to them, and in some cases, even if they were known as suspect. And I would be remiss if I did not note that it was this privilege, this sense for so many of us, the type of social capital that most African Americans do not have, that helped to make Trayvon Martin's story a national story. Just as Emmett Till's northern roots and middle class status, at least as compared to other African Americans, had done so in 1955. Like President Obama, who asserted during a press conference, quote, "If I had a son, he would look like Trayvon," end quote. And much like Northern Blacks who were forced to do when the Chicago-born Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi in 1955, in 2012, I, like parents of African American children before me and all around me, grappled with the notion that it could be my son next, that it could be my family member next. And soon after that, George Zimmerman was acquitted of the charges against him, and I discovered a burgeoning body of scholarship on cultural trauma. And as I pointed out, as scholars like Jeffrey Alexander and Ron Ironman have explained, not all devastating occurrences or incidents result in cultural traumas. No discrete historical event or situation automatically qualifies as a cultural trauma. What ultimately matters in determining whether something has resulted in cultural trauma is whether the disorienting event or tragedy is effectively communicated as a trauma. In other words, to become a cultural trauma, an event or situation must not only be disorienting, but it also has to be defined and narrated as a trauma. So as part of my larger book project, I'm stepping back to decipher the very pattern that brings us to cultural trauma for African Americans. And in so doing, I ask myself the question, what is the cycle, if any, that creates and recreates the group-based trauma that African Americans experience, not only after these killings, but more so after the legal responses that have consistently communicated to society and to us that Black lives do not matter. As my title suggests, I refer to this pattern or routine as the new status quo. But today, I'm focusing on a smaller part of this project that grapples with the cultural trauma stage. Today, I'm focusing on what I'm calling the trauma of injustice. So Michael Denzel Smith really captured a collective feeling, I think, among many African Americans when the verdict in the George Zimmerman trial came down. Right. When we heard not guilty, our hearts broke collectively. In that moment, it was clear that Black life had no value. Emotions poured out, emotions that are real, natural, and normal as we grieve for Trayvon and his stolen humanity. So there were lots and lots of commonalities between the trial of Trayvon Martin and that involving Emmett Till. So Milam, Bryant, Zimmerman were all charged, tried, and then acquitted of murder at the end of their trial. And the death of these two children, Till and Trayvon, and the lack of punishment for their killers helped to ignite two major social movements. Till's death played an important role, as you know, in sparking the civil rights movement, with Rosa Parks famously saying, quote, "I thought of Emmett Till, and when the bus driver ordered me to move to the back, I just couldn't move," end quote. And as the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi have explained to us, the Black Lives Matter movement grew directly out of their responses to the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin murder trial. Here's my intervention So one of the things I did in sort of looking and comparing both the Emmett Till trial and the Trayvon Martin trial is I began to intervene and say what was missing in cultural trauma theory. And one of the things I began to say is that it doesn't have to arise out of a long-standing, something that is unexpected or a shock to the system, a shock to the routine. It can arise out of something that is actually expected, right? In particular, for groups that have been marginalized and oppressed, that kind of oppression, that kind of devaluing that has become to almost be expected um, is can result in a cultural trauma. It doesn't have to be something that is unexpected, right? So cultural traumas can arise not only when the routine is disrupted, but also when regularly expected negative occurrences take place and are reaffirmed. And in an article I wrote in sociological theory, I laid out what are the elements that have to exist for cultural trauma to materialize out of an expected negative occurrence. There has to be this long-standing history of the routine harm that basically leads a group to expect no other outcome. The underlying facts have to be, in some respects, so halting or so memorable, so shocking that they are garnering the kind of attention that a broader group would know about it in order for there to be a broad cultural impact on the group. And there has to be public discourse about the meaning of the routine trauma. Now, Professor Saida Grundy, who is my colleague here in sociology at Boston University, during an open plenary panel on our day of collective engagement and on racism and anti-racism BU, highlighted how these particular sociological problems can come in cycles, repeating themselves in adapted and unadapted forms in 100 years, even fewer years. Looking at the cultural trauma, Jeffrey Alexander highlighted 4 parts of the cultural trauma narrative. The 4 parts of the cultural trauma narrative: the nature of the pain, which is the injury to the group, the relation of the trauma victim to the wider audience, which is the extent to which members of the audience identify with the victims, and attribution of responsibility, right? Who are the people who perpetrated the trauma, and the nature of the victim, the group affected most by the pain. So I am looking to extend my work on cultural trauma experienced by African Americans by asking how cultural trauma emerges for Blacks in a post-civil rights era. When I was talking about the trauma of the routine, I was looking at trauma, focusing in particular on the Emmett Till trial, something that occurred in the pre-civil rights era, in an era where it was widely known among Blacks that there was really no protection for African Americans in the law. And so now I'm looking at how does cultural trauma occur for Blacks in a post-civil rights era as opposed to a pre-civil rights era, right? And this is in response to the legal outcomes that civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump has called the legal genocide of Black people, or what I refer to as the new status quo. And that's referring to Oliver Cox's very famous article from 1945, Lynching as Status Quo. So unlike in the pre-civil rights era, Blacks today, well, we would not expect that Blacks today would unquestionably presume that white men, even police officers, who killed an unarmed and or non-threatening Black would escape without judicial punishment, because in our post-civil rights era, there's supposed to be more equal protection of the laws. In fact, in our post-civil rights era, many Black individuals have sincerely hoped prior to a trial or a grand jury's trial that the police and quasi-police killers of unarmed and or non-threatening Blacks would actually suffer legal punishment for their actions. So in looking at this question, I did a variety of things. My research assistants and I were all of different races, all of different ages. They're all in their 20s and I'm of undescribed age. We all interviewed a variety of lawyers and law students of all races. And we're still very far from done. We still have many more interviews to do. But my hypothesis at the outset of this project was that cultural trauma for Blacks in response to police and quasi-police killings would by and large remain in the form of trauma of the routine, something that would be expected. We would expect repeated indictments and non-indictments and repeated acquittals. And I chose lawyers and law students in particular to interview because I thought, given their choice in education and profession, they were more likely than any other group of Blacks to hold a strong belief in formal systems of justice. After all, lawyers upon admission to the bar frequently take oaths that indicate a commitment and belief in legal systems. And I thought, were a cultural trauma narrative to emerge in the form of the trauma of the routine for this group of Blacks, chances are that view would be shared more broadly across a broader population of Black Americans. Because of our standing as a lawyer, law dean, and students, we had easy access to lawyer and law student populations. And so we use a mixture of both convenience sampling, meaning a non-representative sampling of individuals who are nearest and most available to us, and snowball sampling, meaning we were asking those people, whom else do you think we should be speaking to as a result of our conversations with you? And I think it's important for me to note, this relates very much to my findings, which I'll expose to you in a bit, is that while no non-Black individuals who were approached to participate in an interview refused to do so, several Black prospective subjects declined to engage in an interview for the study because they knew they could not handle discussing it. They thought it would be too painful or too harmful, too emotionally painful to engage in these interviews. All right. So based on my interviews thus far, I see cultural trauma emerging for Blacks in two different forms in response to the repeated non-indictments acquittal of police officers and quasi-police officers who kill unarmed and or non-threatening Blacks during the post-civil rights era. So we see something in the trauma of the routine, as I detailed in my sociological theory article and as I briefly explained to you, but we also see what I'm calling now the trauma of injustice, which I say arises from a different type of shattering of the expected, a shattering of the promise and narrative of equality and justice that has become an important part of this nation's post-civil rights storyline. The response to the acquittal in this generation's Emmett Till trial, the Trayvon Martin trial, illustrates the presence of these two forms of cultural trauma. So on the one hand, you saw the trauma of the routine emerge through the voices of many Blacks who doubted that a jury would actually ever find George Zimmerman guilty, and who then later experienced the pain of that expectation when it became a reality, and who also absorbed an understanding of what that verdict meant for the value of Black life in the United States. At the same time, one also heard and witnessed the emergence of a slightly different narrative about the trauma of injustice for Blacks who sincerely hoped for the conviction of George Zimmerman. So, for example, despite a long history of killings of Blacks by white men who later evaded legal punishment entirely or received minimal punishment, many Blacks in contemporary society, including Trayvon Martin's parents, had faith that justice would be served through the conviction and imprisonment of George Zimmerman. And many expressed shock, disappointment, and dismay at the jury's decision to acquit. Right. In fact, the substantive questions in my interview script begin with the question about Trayvon Martin, moving on to discuss other cases in general, and then ends with questions about Emmett Till, right? Asking questions like, do you recall where you were when you heard that Trayvon Martin had been shot and killed, right? Or do you recall where you were when you heard the verdict? And then the penultimate question was, of course, after Trayvon Martin was killed, Oprah Winfrey famously said, Trayvon Martin, parallel to Emmett Till, let me just tell you in my mind, same thing. What was your reaction to this comment when you first learned of it? So now I want to tell you a little bit both about the trauma, the routine, and the trauma, and just to give you a couple of examples of what we found. So for some people, there was a trauma of the routine. There was this long-standing history of discrimination, of no protection of African Americans in our legal system. And so people expected there would not be a conviction in any police killing cases. But there was still a deep harm for the community as a whole as a result. So you see these two strands. On the one hand, you see some people exhibiting a trauma of the routine, and some people exhibiting a trauma of injustice. This is an example from Astrid Johnson. I'm using all pseudonyms. She's a 39-year-old Black female lawyer on the acquittal of George Zimmerman. She expected a charge in the case, but didn't expect a conviction. And she says, I was not expecting anything in terms of a conviction. It was not shocking to me that he did not get convicted, but it was heartbreaking. So something can be both not expected and also devastating. That's what it felt like, that nothing has changed and that I needed to be afraid. I remember listening to the announcement. It was in the evening, I think, several hours after the jury had been dismissed. And police were out, and my son was a couple of months old. And I remember listening to it and then walking to his bedroom while he was asleep in his crib and just crying over his crib. The verdict said to me, this could be my child. Nothing has changed. I brought a young Black male into the world where someone can kill him in the street for just living and there will be no justice for him. And this was both not surprising, but also devastating. It marked a real cynicism in my thoughts about race in the United States. Before then, I don't think I was optimistic, but I wasn't as cynical as I became after that. So she continues, I ask her, and when you say nothing has changed, you mean nothing has changed from when? And she says, from slavery. I mean, that seems a bit extreme because obviously people are not traded as property anymore. But the sense that there are some people who are second class citizens, the sense that Black people are not fully human, the sense that white people can treat Black people like they're not fully human and get away with it, and that people will not only let them get away with it, but that it would be considered justified, that none of that has changed. And so the optics feel different. And obviously people are getting lynched, are not getting lynched right. But a commitment to the subordination of Black people is still there, and that hasn't changed. All right, we continue on with the interview, and at some point I ask her about the impact of the repeated acquittals and non-indictments in a variety of cases after we've talked about cases ranging from Tamir Rice to Philando Castile and a number of others. She says, it corrodes your, what's the impact? It corrodes your sense of safety. It corrodes your faith in your democracy. It corrodes relationships with people who are not willing to engage the horror of these repeated incidents. And that when you think about things like hypertension, depression, heart disease in Black communities, and I think this is a lot of it, this ambient stress that never goes away because one, you realize it could happen to you, and two, nobody around you is talking about it until there's a gaslighting effect of it, right? Like, I know this thing is happening, but y'all sit around here in the coffee room like it's a normal Tuesday, right? And so I think people underestimate how much it corrodes. And the lack of sensitivity to that is a double injury on top of the actual acquittal itself. And I think people underestimate the sense of that. So one of the things I didn't expect in starting this project is I didn't expect to see the trauma of the routine necessarily occur among people who were of a younger age, in their 20s or so. But it ended up actually there were quite a few people who were in their 20s who exhibited actually a trauma of routine narrative, right? So here's a quote from Ifeoma Odoba. She's a 24-year-old Black female student. Her initial response to hearing about the killing of Trayvon Martin, quote, wasn't tears, but, quote, just more of a this is life. And I guess the quote, thank God there was some type of witness, end quote, on the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And this is when she was in high school. And of course, once I thought about it, it made more sense that they would have a trauma of the routine narrative because this is a generation that has seen repeated videotapes where this is getting even more attention and they're hearing about and seeing the repeated acquittals and repeated non-indictments. So she says in response to about her hearing of the killing of Trayvon Martin and the acquittal of George Zimmerman, she says, I was not surprised. And again, I think this goes to juries. I don't really have faith in the criminal justice system to some extent due to just seeing patterns of what occurs to those who hurt people that look like me, even when there's evidence stacked against them. So I didn't have hopes the jury would make that change, but I think there are some times, you say, oh, this person looks empathetic, so maybe they will convict. And again, you don't know what happens behind closed doors during the jury deliberations. All they need is one word, so villainize and say, yep, acquit. And so the question, what did the acquittal at the end of the trial signify to you? That we don't matter. So this is from a 24-year-old Black law student. I'll move on to the next quote. And so then one of the questions was, how likely do you think it is that officers will be charged and convicted for killing unarmed Blacks in the future? And she continues, I don't think it'll happen. I think it may be some years. And what's interesting was the first thing that came to mind was a kid who would lead to a white officer being convicted would have to be adopted. And the kid would have to be adopted by a white family for it to be respected, which is crazy. But that is what first came to mind. Like, that would be how an officer would finally get convicted. A lot of people say that our generation is the most social justice oriented, or at least the most involved in calling people out. And now we have technology. But we've also seen that technology doesn't play a big factor in cases. So the possibility of conviction comes down to more humanization. The prosecution would have to have so much evidence the kid had never done anything in their life, straight A student, didn't look a certain type of way, probably looked more racially ambiguous, then gone. That's all I see. Yeah. So she's imagining what's the case like going to be like. We've had a few convictions, and they have mirrored right almost a perfect victim, right? Kind of. She's imagining. So here, the trauma of injustice is so we have the trauma of the routine, expected, but still really devastating harm. The trauma of injustice is people who thought there would be some kind of justice, there would be some kind of conviction, and then the pain of the repeated message that the legal system does not work for African Americans in the same way that it works for whites. So this is Stephanie Jenkins, a 45-year-old Black female lawyer on the acquittal of George Zimmerman. She was confident that the justice system would work appropriately and that there would be some accountability and consequence for Trayvon Martin's killer when she first learned about his death. And so she says in an interview to me, after the acquittal, it was just horror, deep, not just sadness, but this sense of powerlessness, because I have a young son who was very young at the time. He's now approaching the age that Trayvon Martin was at the time that he got killed. I, just as a mother, I felt powerless. It was just the most heart-wrenching thing that I was very emotionally distraught when that verdict came out. I mean, I was really just, oh, clearly, this is not the way the law is supposed to work. I think that was a moment that I really did get a greater consciousness of the moment we now realize that we're in, which is the Black Lives Matter moment. I think that we all developed a more acute awareness of just how far we have not come, because there was this sense that we made real progress. After all, we were celebrating, we were still giddy from the first Black president. Everybody had just celebrated how far we had come. Like I said, I'd brought myself out of one socioeconomic strata into a whole other strata for my own life. The acquittal was this very stark reminder that Black people were still very much threatened in the public domain simply because we were Black. We were feared, particularly Black men. That gave me real great concern as a mother, as a wife, and as a Black woman, as an activist and a scholar, that we really had a lot more work to do than we all thought when we celebrated the election of Barack Obama. I asked about what's the meaning of George Zimmerman's acquittal for Blacks, and she said it meant that our justice system that we are expected to put our faith in to resolve grievances on behalf of us as citizens, our legitimate grievances, was not available for me as a Black citizen, right? It just did not work for me. It meant we also can't engage in self-help because that's going to get us in trouble. Again, it's this overwhelming powerlessness. It's what are you supposed to do? What options are you left with? You can't protect them, your children. You can't vindicate them. You can't vindicate yourself. How are you supposed to exist in that world? It just felt so incredibly unfair, so frustrating, so overwhelmingly, like I said, it was just completely disempowering. It's not just the jury's acquit, it's that prosecutors fail to charge, it's that police officers cover up, that the media spins by finding a joint in a bag or finding a tape that says maybe he did something. I don't know. At this point, I guess I'm grappling with that reality. When she's talking about the meaning of the acquittal for her as a parent, she said, my son remembers the verdict because he would tell you it's the first time that he remembers seeing me cry. I mean, I was bawling. It was just really, like I said, deeply emotional, visceral, physical reaction. When he asked me what was wrong, I just told him that I felt powerless. I felt so sad that I felt like I couldn't protect him right. There's nothing we can do about the fact that our boys will be vulnerable in this way. Not only will they not be protected from that harm, we cannot even vindicate, right? The harm after the fact. That just as a mother, what do you do with that? I can't protect you, and I can't even do anything to vindicate your death, right? It just makes me upset every time I think about it. So here's another example of trauma of injustice, also coming from a 38-year-old Black female lawyer on the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And she says, I feel like maybe I was more naive in that, yeah, I actually thought when I heard both versions of the facts, I still thought, wait, he's being a vigilante. There's still a crime, even though he's now subsequently claiming self-defense. He started it. I mean, it's still like he was the initial aggressor, so I felt that he should have been charged with a crime, and I actually believed he would be. So convicted. So as the trial went on, even though I wasn't necessarily following it, the actual trial, I was still following like the news commentary. So they started with the character assassination of Trayvon, like, oh, he had smoked weed, he'd been delinquent, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, okay, maybe he's not, they're gonna try to like reduce the charges, right? So I thought maybe they're gonna acquit him of the second degree, but still there's manslaughter, right? Because in the manslaughter could be like you're both at fault. It's a bar fight, right? Essentially. So you're still positing that both people are not as pure, which is, I think, what they tried to do with Trayvon, show that he's not this innocent child, right? That's how the media tried to paint him. So yes, I was surprised too when he was acquitted. I was like, what? Yeah, it was very surprising and disappointing. I asked her also about the meaning of the acquittal for George Zimmerman. So, I mean, it was super disappointing and super saddening. I think for me, it highlighted the persistent second class citizenship of Black people in America. I think it highlighted that we don't enjoy equal protection under the law, that this was not the case because I felt, like I said, even if it was a bar fight, which it was not, but if it was a bar fight, that person would have been convicted of a manslaughter charge. There were two white men fighting in a bar and one shot the other or even hit him on the head with a chair, meaning not trying to kill him and he died, that's manslaughter. So for this to be like someone pulling out their gun, shooting someone who's not armed and they're still acquitted, and the difference is that somebody is Black. I mean, I think that it just showed to me Black people's lives are not valued as equally as white people's lives in America. It was super disappointing, super saddening. Yeah, very, very saddening. And then finally, she's talking about. I asked her about the impact of the repeated acquittals and non-indictments in police killing cases on African Americans. So these indictments do have a social impact or do have a mental health impact, I think, on African Americans because they do send a message as to what your position is in society. They send a message as to how vigilant you need to be or should be. These all have social and mental health repercussions because you now perceive yourself as a second class citizen, and it can have chilling effects on wanting to be adventurous. Then it affects mental health, as in like being hypervigilant causes anxiety, right? Living like that on a daily to day basis, being hypervigilant, it's taxing, it's emotionally and mentally taxing. So I think these killings do have impacts that last past even the acquittal, past even when they're no longer talked about in the media. Yeah. Here's what really interesting. It's not really trauma of the routine, but it's something I'm also playing around with and looking at the involuntary intergenerational trauma, or what I'm even calling perhaps even intersectional cultural trauma. This is a quote from Stephanie Jenkins, who you heard from before, 45-year-old Black female lawyer, on the warning she gives her sons. One of the things I would ask people about is, how these cases change how you speak to your children about these things. And everybody knows about the talk, which is a talk that African American parents have to give their children, or parents of African American children have to give their children on how to interact with the police, or if one has been stopped. And she says we had to have a conversation about how you don't get to move through the world like a white boy. That's just not how you get to live your life, is what she said to her son. Because you're not going to be given the same benefit of the doubt. You're not going to be treated the same. The consequences are going to be different for you, and they could be deadly. I can't have that on my conscience. I need you to understand how to protect yourself. Part of it is not just engaging in these protective acts when you interact with police. And she continues, people talk about how Black parents deprive their children of the innocence of youth because we punish them and we're overly restrictive and kids should have freedom, more freedom. No, you deprived us, society, of giving our children the innocence of their youth because now we can't allow them that. I feel horrible that I cannot allow my child the innocence of youth. I'd much rather have my child lacking the innocence of youth than to have my child enjoy his youth and perhaps die because of it. I mean, I just can't make that trade off. So very interesting, even though we like to think that much has changed in the world, much has changed in society. We're in a post-civil rights world versus a pre-civil rights world, that there's greater protection of African Americans, there's a greater value on African American life. And yet you'll see that one of the they're even in a post-civil rights era, we see the trauma of the routine emerge among lawyers who are people who we would presume would have the greatest faith in our legal system or the criminal justice system. And then a trauma of injustice also emerging among lawyers, right? When we're talking about people who are generally more privileged than most African Americans, generally would feel like there would be greater vindication than most African Americans, and yet we still see these cultural trauma narratives emerging. And I think that is something that we must confront as a country, and we need to have honest conversations and honest reflection on how far we have truly come in 2021. Thank you.